Hi, Jonathan York from Bay Financial Partners, looking at the investment markets. Pretty interesting time still out there. The latest jobless numbers from the US was pretty much sort of a Goldilocks scenario where you're still having reasonable growth, around sort of 130 odd thousand jobs created, which given the current unemployment rate is sort of pretty consistent with pretty much full employment. Because the unemployment rate at 3.5 is now the lowest for nearly 50 years. So that does give the Fed a little bit of a respite out there, considering that supposedly the economy was slowing a little bit. Obviously, the worry is that sort of increase in jobs numbers starts to reduce a little bit, especially as we head into the Christmas period. Now, against that, sort of a few weeks ago, there was a few sort of overnight funding issues as well in the US, and the Fed has now come out this morning and said they're looking at expanding the balance sheet to try and smooth these sort of funding issues over. But obviously, there's always the sort of possibility as well of a further rate cut in November or December. So as you head into earnings reporting season, it's going to be pretty interesting to see how that sort of plays through. Certainly, a few earnings sort of guidance have been revised downwards, and just going to be interesting to see how they sort of play through, and also as well guidance for sort of fourth quarter. Now, against that, obviously, President Trump facing increasing pressure out there on the impeachment inquiries. And interestingly, this morning, the administration banned the US ambassador to the European Union from testifying on the hearings. And obviously, quite an interesting development because Trump all along has said there was nothing sort of untoward. The call to the Ukrainian president was above board, was totally 100% perfect, etc., etc. So if there was no issues with that call and there's no issues about him sort of trying to exert influence on his political opponents, why doesn't he allow his staff and representatives to testify before Congress? Probably from the sort of neutral observer, it looks like there is something to hide. And President Trump has really sort of doubled down on this as well in a further sort of question and answer session last week. He also suggested that maybe China should open an investigation into the Bidens as well. Which does seem sort of quite strange because obviously, he's under investigation for supposedly using his position as president to exert undue influence on a foreign leader in a foreign country, to investigate one of his political opponents. And now he's coming out and saying, well, actually, another country should do it as well. Very interesting times in the US, and I say especially as you head into sort of 2020 in that election year. Interesting as well, oil has really come back really quite aggressively, back below sort of 55 on WTI now, and the sort of Saudi spike now is a distant memory. But interesting, has that been translated into a price fall at the pumps? Not yet. With Brexit, we're now into the second week of October. PM Johnson has said the UK will be coming out 31st of October. But all along, the deal that he sort of put forward to the European Union has met with sort of pretty lukewarm reception. And various sort of comments on the tape appear to imply that a deal is certainly a long way off yet. Now, if that is the case, Prime Minister Johnson really doesn't appear to have a sort of a plan B, because Parliament has sort of passed law that a no deal is not an option. So are we heading for a constitutional crisis in the UK? Australia, after the not really surprise cut from the Reserve Bank to take interest rates down to 0.75, but certainly, it was sort of maybe a little bit of a surprise in the timing. And you would hope that, certainly these low rates now will start to sort of stimulate, one, the housing market, but also the economy as well. And certainly in the housing market, there appears to be a few signs that maybe the market is recovering a little bit. Certainly there appears to be a little bit more activity out there, and certainly the rate of house price falls appears to be abating. Interesting time in New Zealand here as well, because certainly business confidence is pretty low. The government's policies don't seem to be getting any traction and sort of instilling any confidence within the business community within New Zealand. And then this week they released the state of their books, which were much better than anticipated. A surplus of 7.5 billion versus an estimated sort of surplus of 3.5. Now that sort of begs the questions now of what they're going to do with that money. Really they should be getting sort of some infrastructure spending on the way and a bit of spending going through just to, support the economy, because certainly the economy is falling a little bit and sort of slowing down. Really, if you were cynical, you'd say, maybe they're holding back because certainly there's been no talk of any tax cuts. That potentially is next year, 2020, and surprise, surprise, that's an election year. But of course, it won't be an election bribe if they look to reduce income taxes next year. So certainly some interesting decisions sort of waiting for the government to sort of act on, and it's just going to be very interesting to see how it plays through. Say against this sort of backdrop of a sort of slowing economy and potentially the Reserve Bank looking at taking interest rates in New Zealand below 1% as well. But interesting, as we head into spring, normally that's a bit of a sign for sort of housing markets sort of pick up. And I say with these record low interest rates, that appears to be the case. But obviously for savers, they're a bit of a disadvantage with falling interest rates. Their sort of term deposits and bond rates aren't as high as they were. Now, if you are looking for income options, there's plenty of alternatives available out there. And call us on 0800 867 323 or go to the website www.bayfinancialpartners.co.nz for lots of interesting articles, and we'll look forward to speaking to you soon.